If beauty makes available a presence, including the presence of mystery that is revealable by painting and manifest in our perception of the world and others, how might literature reveal it also? The answer lies, so I shall suggest, in how certain works of literature can be phenomenological. Not that the work in question merely is inspired, influenced, or informed by the ideas and the thoughts of phenomenological figures, but that the work itself is a phenomenological work. With an eye to explaining how Robinson's fiction is this kind of literary exercise in phenomenology, it's worthwhile first to draw attention to the striking parallels between two characters in Faulkner's novel, Light in August, the Reverend Hightower and Joe Christmas, and Robinson's own characters of Ames and Jack. It's not just that Ames and Jack in many respects bear a deep, important resemblance to Faulkner's characters. Faulkner's depiction of Hightower and Christmas is representative of how Light in August is phenomenological as a whole. And just as Claude Romano contends in Le Chant de Vie, Phenomenologie de Faulkner, that Faulkner's fiction is phenomenology, so too is Robinson's own. For if, as Romano says, quote, literature is a work of truth, end quote, such truth is not the objective or scientific truth that can be summarized in a list of propositions. It is rather, as Rudd had said of painting and Kempson Rogers have said of, quote, aesthetic insight, a disclosure of the world as it is perceived. And here, this kind of truth Romano identifies in Faulkner is at work in Robinson too. Quote, the truth in question means unveiling, pure showing, the appearing of what is, end quote. Robinson's depiction of her characters, like Faulkner's, involves a vision unveiling the world's appearing as a whole. What may otherwise have appeared to be Romano's perplexing observation of Faulkner, namely, quote, it's precisely because their source is never in ideas that Faulkner's novels are philosophical, end quote, that it begins to make sense. A work of philosophical literature can be said to be philosophical insofar as it's phenomenological, which is to say, insofar as it returns us to the things themselves by showing us what it aims to unveil. Robinson's fiction, like Faulkner's, is philosophical not because of a vision borrowing from the ideas of Freud, Feuerbach, Nietzsche, Calvin, Barthes, or whomever else, but because it discloses the world as it shows itself to its characters. What Romano takes to be an injunction for Faulkner's reader applies then just as well to Robinson's one. Quote, simply look, see with me, and if you penetrate deeply enough into the heart of my vision, you will see then what I'm trying to say, end quote. Of course, the question arises, but which vision are we to choose, Faulkner's or Robinson's? In Faulkner's eyes, the world is one in which God ultimately is absent and not to be found, and thus one in which death possesses the last word on human life, whereas in Robinson's, the world is one whose beauty indicates the promise of resurrection. The question Robinson's phenomenological fiction raises is one for Romano. What grounds, particularly phenomenological grounds, are there for preferring Faulkner's vision of being in the world over Robinson's vision of being before God? Which account, in short, is the more truthful? Published in 1932, Faulkner's seventh novel, Light in August, tells the story of how the lives of its multiple characters come to intersect in the town of Jefferson, Mississippi, during the interwar years of Prohibition in the Jim Crow South. Lena Grove, a pregnant teenager, has hit the road, leaving her Alabama town behind in search of the unborn baby's father, Lucas Birch. Birch has not been heard from ever since having left, claiming that he would be in touch once he found work and a place for them to marry and settle down together. Eventually, Grove tracks him down in the town of Jefferson, where he's been working at a mill under the assumed name of Joe Brown after having run off. Working alongside him at the mill is Joe Christmas, a 30-year-old childhood orphan who, after killing his strict and abusive Presbyterian adopted father by smashing a chair over his head, has for the last 15 years been living as a drifter and societal outcast in virtue of believing himself to be of mixed-race heredity. We come to find that Christmas's biological grandfather, the source of this original claim, may have been lying. The two men, who are running a bootlegging operation on the side, live together in a small cabin on the property of Joanna Burden's family estate, Burden being a middle-aged spinster who's the descendant of a New England abolitionist carpetbagger family. And finally, there's the elderly Reverend Gale Hightower, who lives as a recluse in his small home, passing his time reading, shunned by everyone in town, after having to resign years ago as the church pastor in the wake of his unfaithful, alcoholic, and mentally unstable wife's committing suicide in a Memphis hotel room. It's Hightower and Christmas who are worthy of comment in relation to Gilead's Ames and Jack, and the sense in which that work itself as a whole is a work of phenomenology. If, quote, Faulkner's characters do not escape their past, end quote, as Romano says, Light and August Hightower is an especially obvious example of such a case. He lives encased in a fixed present in which he fails to be open or receptive to anything, owing to his being immersed in a nostalgic yearning for a mythical past. Like a ghost, he does not dwell in the Jefferson around him, so much as he inhabits only a memory of the place, or what he believes to be a memory of it. He lives, more precisely, in a memory of the town inspired by a vision of his grandfather's courageous death in a Civil War cavalry charge against a Yankee position. The vision of his grandfather's bravery and glorious death is what drew him to Jefferson to begin with as a young pastor. He'd requested the seminary send him to Jefferson, and it was this vision that dominated his understanding of his own religious vocation as a pastor, even as it alienated both his wife and his church's parishioners. Eventually, his lonely wife lapses into alcoholism and infidelity, taking frequent trips to Memphis where she meets other men. Hightower, however, remains inattentive and unconcerned, even as the town learns of his wife's behavior. When she finally commits suicide by leaping from a hotel room in Memphis during one of her affairs, the outraged residents of Jefferson demand that he resign as pastor when he shows no remorse or grief over her death. After stepping down from the church, for years he lives in seclusion, spending his time reading. Despite some significant differences between Hightower and Ames that we might comment in a moment, the striking parallels are as numerous as they are obvious and undeniable. Robinson, of course, has read her Faulkner, which lends high credence to the hypothesis that the similarities between Hightower and Christmas and Ames and Jack, respectively, are intentional. Whether Ames himself is aware of his resemblance to Hightower is another matter, though Faulkner's novel was published in 1932, which means Ames, who was writing his letters to Robbie in the 1950s, would have been able to read it. He does not anywhere mention Hightower. At one point, he does mention having read Diary of a Country Priest. Perhaps he doesn't discuss Light and August, even if he had read it and recognized his own resemblance to Hightower, because Faulkner's portrait of the latter's own loneliness and preoccupation with his ancestral past is less than flattering. In any case, like Hightower, Ames is a preacher preoccupied by his familial ancestry, especially the family's history in the ante and post-bellum period. In Ames's case, his grandfather was a free soiler who rode and fought with John Brown in Kansas. Like Hightower, Ames was a widower. And again, like Hightower, Ames spends his years after the death of his wife in lonely solitude, what Ames himself describes, in contrast to the later, quote, years of happiness with Lila, as, quote, those dark years, quote, my own dark time, quote, the time of my loneliness, or simply, quote, the long night. Both Hightower and Ames, as the latter confides, believe that, quote, solitude would be a balm for loneliness, end quote, that the night might be so sweetly tender so as to deliver them from the wound of the past. But these two nightingales who sing their mute song of solitude and exile do not find peace in the ecstatic visions of their respective grandfathers' glorious paths, nor in the expectancy of any future for themselves. They inhabit a pastime, one perhaps that never really even was, but is instead a construction of their own fantasy and imagination. What Romano says of Hightower, thus, can just as well be said of Robinson's Ames. Quote, "The Reverend Hightower, in Light and August, is haunted by the specters of the past and is himself a specter." End quote. Hence, as with Hightower, Ames lives in memory and imagination, and hence in that respect more so than he does the actual world, and it might be said to exhibit a form of life denial that Kemp and Rogers are concerned with answering. Before examining the final and most important parallel between Hightower and Ames, one directly relevant to the matter of life affirmation and Robinson's phenomenology's depiction of what such a life should look like, it's necessary to mention Faulkner's Joe Christmas, a character who in many respects cannot help but be seen as an inspiration for Robinson's Jack. Faulkner is commonly thought of a writer who, as Romano says, quote, "is a Puritan, haunted by the belief in original sin and predestination," end quote. And although Romano disagrees with this interpretation of Faulkner, it certainly is fitting for Faulkner's character Joe Christmas. Everything that Romano notes can be said of Faulkner's Christmas applies to Jack also. Like Christmas, Jack is, quote, "an enigma to himself," that is, quote, "a stranger to himself." Like Christmas, Jack is incapable of receiving kindness and gratitude from others, particularly from women. Jack's relationship to Della, and to a lesser extent Glory, proves to be the notable exception. Like Christmas in the South, Jack is a social pariah in St. Louis and Gilead. Like Christmas, Jack lives a life of alcoholism and debauchery, trapped in a cycle of self-destructive self-degradation, a fatalistic, quote, "cycle of repetition," by which he perversely confirms his own sense of being predestined to perdition. For Christmas, this sense of radical forlornness is a response to the trauma he experiences from early childhood abuse and abandonment, a fact that leads Romano to entitle the section dedicated to an analysis of Christmas, quote, "wounded memory," an expression emphasizing at once that Christmas was traumatized in his past, and that the trauma in question leaves him without a history insofar as he has no memory of where he came from and thus who he is. It's worth noting that although there's no suggestion in any of the four Gilead novels that Jack was the victim of abuse in the Boughton home or at church, his guilt complex, coupled with his sense of fundamental unworthiness of God's forgiveness and sense of loneliness and isolation, is entirely consistent with what psychiatrists say is true of someone who's experienced childhood trauma, particularly in the forms of sexual or spiritual abuse. This impression is only further strengthened by the nature of his alcoholism, the spiritual roots of which seem to lie in his pathological need for control, in what Jean-Louis Chrétien calls, quote, "the desire for mastery over reality," end quote. Again, a form of spiritual masochism expressive of an underlying sense of being abandoned by a God who will not forgive him of the sins for which he must thus in turn punish himself. Kemp and Rogers notice this about Jack as well. Quote, "Jack feels a kind of freeing sensation in the committing of a serious wrong. It confirms for him that everything is his fault, just as he suspected," end quote. As they note, this, quote, "destructive dynamic," one we have seen is similar to Christmas's own traumatic, quote, "cycle of repetition," is in Jack's case rooted in the fact he's someone, quote, "who has felt all his life as if he has been headed inexorably for perdition," end quote. In short, felt that there's, quote, "something wrong with him," end quote. In Gilead, this makes Jack someone whom Ames himself terms a mystery, someone who others feel they never truly know or understand, as well as someone who remains just as much a mystery even to himself. Kemp and Rogers go on to claim that for Jack, the central problem of his life is that he wants to be, or at least believe himself to be, quote, "responsible for the pain and difficulty of his life." But is he? End quote. Now, unlike Kemp and Rogers, who in effect answer no, I shall answer yes. But before explaining the rationale for that answer and why it matters for assessing Robinson's phenomenological vision of providence, we must first consider the shared end that Hightower and Christmas meet in Light in August, and how that of Ames and Jack at the conclusion to Gilead is the culmination of Robinson's portrayal of a world very different than the one depicted by Faulkner. We thus could conclude this aspect of our discussion with some general remarks about the nature of truth in philosophical literature, that is to say, phenomenological fiction. Turning again to Faulkner, or Romano's reading of Faulkner, more specifically, can illustrate the place of truthfulness in literature. Romano understands Faulkner's literary enterprise as an exercise in realism. Quote, "The author's goal is, in a way, to return to the things themselves, to reveal the world in stata nascendi, more exactly, to immerse us in it," end quote. As Romano notes, fiction thus is a work of truth. Quote, "It will do no good to object that the world of the novel is fictive, for the quasi-world of fiction is a variant of the world as such, a blueprint which reveals its invariable structures of essence," end quote. Faulkner's literary vision, which in this respect is phenomenological, quote, "differs from that of the structuralist, formalist, or deconstructionist critic, for whom the text is sufficient in itself and is reduced to the internal laws of its functioning. As soon as the work exists as a work, it's an extension of our existence in the world," end quote. Romano highlights this with an analysis of Faulkner's character, Benji, from The Sound and the Fury. Through a description of Benji's perception and experience of the world, Faulkner unveils a dimension of the perceived world that would otherwise remain overlooked. In a way, Faulkner's depiction of Benji's being in the world provides the sort of phenomenological description one might expect from Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception, for example. Benji, as Romano notes, quote, "is not first of all an idiot. He's a pure witness to the appearance, casting a primitive gaze over the world. He's the one through whom the world manifests itself in its radical facticity, in its pure and naked givenness. In Benji's eyes, the world returns to the original state of pure manifestation, without cause or reason," end quote. The constitutive paradox of this enterprise, the literary one no less than the philosophical one, is that it's a question of giving voice to the mute experience, of making it express its own meaning as it emerges from beneath all speech, and thereby to forge a new, original speech, which draws upon and follows the world's inflections and adapts to its lineaments, end quote, says Romano. For readers familiar with their Husserl, it's clear that Romano sees Faulkner as engaging in the attempt to return to what Husserl called, quote, anti-predicative experience. Phenomenological fiction recovers this, quote, immanent meaning in the sensible, a sense of the senses, prior to any constituted verbal meaning, and thus before any conceptual meaning, end quote. As a phenomenological work of truth, literature in this respect proceeds by an epoché. The writer invites the reader to suspend his ordinary, habitual, customary relation with the world, along with its sedimented ways of perceiving and engaging with it, to enter an aesthetic attitude that thereby draws our attention to features of the world that would otherwise be ignored. Thus, far from fiction bracketing truth, it serves as a locus for its disclosure. To understand the kind of truth at stake, truth as revelation, the successful depiction of which is measured against the standard of what it aims to disclose, can explain why, in turn, a good work of realist literature is considered good. It's faithful to the things themselves, to the ideality it's seen and attempted to disclose. A work of literature does not offer straightforward claims to truth lying in the mundane world. Claims, for example, such as the cat is on the mat. There is no cat or mat. But there is a truth at work nonetheless. If, for instance, Robinson were to have had Gilead's Ames at the end of the novel suddenly murder Lila and Robbie before killing himself, The murder-suicide would rightly be judged as untruthful or unbelievable. It would be false, which is to say, unfaithful and untrue to what it aims to disclose. It would not have been conformed to the truth of the characters and their situation. And again, although these are fictional people and situations, there are still laws of essence that the author's literary vision must heed. A violation of those laws, of their essence, leads inevitably to what will be experienced as off, or unpersuasive, or implausible, or simply false. The author, in short, is not free to write whatever he wishes, because what he writes must be reflective of what he sees, and thus always in turn beholden to what the things themselves reveal, in this case, the personality of Ames and the nature of the situation in which Ames finds himself. The kind of literary vision employed by Faulkner or Robinson will be measured as success or failure by the degree to which it remains faithful to the world it aims to reveal. Literature, then, philosophical literature at least, of the sort under consideration here, is a work of truth insofar as it is phenomenological. While living on Joanna Burden's property, Christmas and Burden carry on an intermittent, sometimes passionate affair. Eventually, Burden becomes restless with the casual arrangement and tells Christmas she desires a child, which he rebuffs. Not long afterwards, she offers to send him north, where he can train to become a lawyer, so that he can return to take over the finances and travel the country with her as a lecturer for, quote, Negro rights. Enraged that Burden wants to disrupt the routine he has come to like, Christmas refuses her offer. One night, after their falling out, he enters the main house and comes up to Burden's bedroom. She asks him to pray with her, which further enrages him. Christmas hates God in part because of the abusive upbringing he's received from his adopted father, the strict Presbyterian Mr. McCurchin. Burden pulls out a revolver with the apparent intention of committing a murder-suicide, but the gun misfires. What exactly happens next in the room between Burden and Christmas is something Faulkner renders ambiguous, or at least not immediately obvious. A description of the scene is omitted from the text. Here, nearly every commentator of Light and August, including even Romano, who otherwise is an impeccably careful reader of the text, assumes that Christmas murders Burden by slicing her throat with the shaving razor he'd been described as having set on her nightstand when first entering the room. The next morning, there's a fire at the house. A bystander finds Joe Brown in a state of disarray coming down the house's stairs. Brown tells the man that nobody's upstairs, but the man goes up to check anyway, where he discovers Burden's dead body. What has happened appears plain enough, it seems to me. Christmas struck Burden with her pistol and fled the property. Sometime after he left, either that night or early in the morning, Brown, who was nursing a grudge against his bootlegging partner, came into the house and murdered Burden, after which he torched the house to conceal the crime. Because he was caught in the house by the man passing by, Brown tells the sheriff that it was Christmas who killed Burden. The sheriff is justifiably unpersuaded by Brown's flimsy story until Brown, in desperation, points out that Christmas is black. At that point, the sheriff essentially eliminates Brown as a suspect and forms a task force to track down Christmas. And interestingly, most commentators conclude, despite all the evidence to the contrary just recounted, that Christmas is indeed the murderer. Perhaps the strongest piece of evidence indicating that he's not, in fact, the culprit is that he never behaves as though he himself knows he will be chased for it. He enters neighboring Mottstown on his way back to Jefferson undisguised, without showing any sign that he's aware there's a manhunt for him. If he had truly raped and murdered Burden, why would he walk right into what he would have known to be his arrest? But in any case, after being arrested in Mottstown, he later escapes when being transferred from the jail. Amid the ensuing chase during his break for freedom, Christmas enters Hightower's house, where Hightower attempts to protect him from the vigilante Percy Grimm, but to no avail. Grimm shoots and castrates a dying Christmas. Hightower, for his part, is described as seeing his own life flash before his eyes with another vision, revealing that his grandfather never actually died in a glorious Civil War battle charge, but instead was shot while stealing chickens from a shed. Hightower's attempt to shield Christmas, along with his delivery of Lena Groves' baby right beforehand, is the closest thing to a redemption Faulkner's world has to offer. Hightower, quote, comes back to the world, re-entering life by taking concerned action for others. Even if he's unable to save Christmas, the Reverend at least does not die a specter. We now again come at last to the matter of Ames, whose own life is, as already noted, reminiscent of Hightower's own in many respects. In his study of Faulkner, Romano notes that for the author, quote, writing is a preparation for dying, end quote. This, of course, is the situation in which we first meet Ames. He's writing letters to his young son in preparation for his own looming death. Yet well into the letters, Ames himself admits that he's perhaps lost sight of his original goal in the course of having strayed into recounting memories of his father and grandfather and other recollections of the past. Quote, sometimes I almost forget my purpose in writing this, he says, which is to tell you things I would have told you if you had grown up with me, things I believe it becomes me as a father to teach you, end quote. At times, in writing these letters preparing for death, it's as if Ames has already left the world and has thus become a specter, as with Hightower. As Kemp and Rogers rightly observe, quote, Ames's ability to confront the failings of his past, culminating in his forgiveness of Jack, is the fulfillment of his argument with Feuerbach. A truly religious life is always and inevitably drawn back into the world, end quote. Just as Hightower redeems himself by re-entering life in the service of others, so too Ames's own religious vision of life is justified through his ethical fulfillment of it. It all turns on his eventual response to the fact that his idyllic, quote, days of happiness with Lila and Robbie have been interrupted by the sudden arrival of Jack Boughton. Quote, there's been a telephone call from Jack Boughton, that is, from John Ames Boughton, my namesake, end quote, Ames writes. As he explains, quote, Jack is still in St. Louis and still planning to come home, end quote. And then Ames makes an observation that will lay the stage for how Jack represents to those who know him something of a prodigal son. Quote, he's not the eldest, or the youngest, or the best, or the bravest, only the most beloved, end quote. We quickly see for ourselves, before Ames apparently sees for himself, the jealousy and resentment he feels towards Jack. Ames himself will eventually name it a, quote, covetousness problem. First, Ames resents the fact that Jack's return to Gilead interrupts the calm and cozy domestic routine he's established. Second, Jack's relative youth is a stark reminder to Ames of his own old age. Ames can see that Jack is able to do things with Robbie that he can't, things he wishes that he had been young enough to do as a father. Jack's playing catch with Robbie, for example, reminds Ames of his playing catch in baseball in his youth with Edward and Boughton. This leads Ames to a more general lament that he couldn't have had his family sooner in life, and that he will not be able to enjoy his family for much longer. And finally, to add apparent insult to injury, there's the fact that Jack threw away the life of a young husband and father that Ames so badly wishes he could have had for himself. Ames eventually tells the story of how Jack in college impregnated a young poor girl and abandoned the resulting daughter, who later died at 3. What breaks with Jack's return, Ames worries that when he passes, Jack may swoop in and take his role. At one point, Ames in his writings subconsciously associates Jack and, quote, jackals, or at least lead Lila and Robbie into thinking so before abandoning them as Jack did his first child and her mother. What breaks Ames out of his myopic and self-centered view of this situation is the injunction to love thy neighbor, to love and forgive Jack, by extending the grace and the mercy God commands he extend. After praying to be able to give Jack an opportunity to be seen fairly and without prejudice, Ames finally encounters Jack as another, not merely as a mere projection of his own fears and worries and preoccupations. An earlier description of this kind of experience of the other that could as well be torn straight from a page of Levinas is one Ames has of Jack. It's an epiphany. Quote, "I realize there's nothing more astonishing than a human face. Boughton and I have talked about that too. It's something to do with incarnation. You feel your obligation to a child when you have seen it and held it. Any human face is a claim on you because you can't help but understand the singularity of it, the courage and loneliness of it." End quote. The commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself manifest in the epiphany of the quote face in Ames's experience of Jack's singularity. Recall the aesthetic insight that Kempin Rogers had said can be an analogy for seeing someone's soul, enjoins Ames to re-enter life, to put his faith to work off the page, as it were. Ames discovers that his fears and suspicions of Jack were ultimately ungrounded. This is not to say that those fears were wholly without rational or evidentiary support. Although ethically or religiously enjoined not to see Jack negatively, Ames was epistemically within his rights for initially having wondered whether Jack would be trouble. At one point in his letters, for instance, Ames writes, quote, "I've never been to St. Louis, a fact I now regret," end quote. He says this because he knows that Jack has spent a number of years living in the city, as had Lila before her having come to Gilead. He feels that they have a connection over this shared place that he doesn't. Given the fact that Jack is known to drink in frequent brothels, and that Lila herself worked as a prostitute for a time, the reader naturally is led to wonder whether Lila and Jack in fact could know each other from St. Louis. In Lila, there's never any explicit mention of Jack or anyone else that fits his description, yet this omission is consistent with their having potentially met nonetheless, since Jack himself is largely a forgettable figure, meaning there's no reason Lila would ever think to remember him. In Jack, again, there's no suggestion that the two ever encounter each other in St. Louis, but because we know that Lila doesn't have a memorable face, it stands to reason that even if Jack had met her, he would not remember it. It so happens we learn that Jack has a wife and a son of his own. He's not come back to Gilead looking for trouble, eyeing Ames's own family like a jackal, but has instead come to the Boughton family house to see whether he might find a place there to make home for Della, his black wife, and their son Robbie. Here Robinson has taken the social ostracization and existential alienation that in Light and August had come from Joe Christmas's mixed identity and shifted the social ostracization that Jack experiences as being due to his multiracial marriage. Jack's sister's Glory's resolution, thus, to stay and look after the Boughton family house after their father's passing is the fulfillment of Jack's prayer. By imagining that Jack's son Robbie might one day come to visit the house in Gilead and see that he has a home here, that his father has a place that will always welcome him, Robinson reveals a gesture that, as Kemp and Rogers say, quote, is not an expression of hope for some kind of redemption, it is itself redemptive, end quote. There's an explicitly theological dimension to Robinson's portrayal of Jack and his troubles worth commenting on as well. As Kemp and Rogers observe, throughout the Gilead novels, Jack is presented as being someone who suspects that the sin that Christianity promises salvation from is not really the quite serious sin that he has committed. Jack is a man who experiences himself to be, quote, a descendant of Adam. To exist is thus to be guilty before God, to have inherited this existential debt, end quote. Here it's worth noting that Robinson's own Calvinism is a form, at least doctrinally, of everything Nietzsche detests about Christianity. Robinson's own characters struggle with the practical consequences of their theological doctrines, particularly predestination. As Ames says himself, predestination is, quote, his least favorite topic of conversation in the whole world, end quote. I would simply note in passing that were one to interpret Jack's situation from one not saddled with Robinson's own Calvinism, his plight appears to admit of a solution. Whereas Kemp and Rogers ultimately view Jack as someone who feels his own sins are too grave to be forgiven, a sense in part informed by his Calvinist upbringing that's led him to worry that he's been damned since birth, it's possible to understand his situation otherwise. Jack's fundamental self-conception, one which in effect amounts to the idea that, quote, the sins of others are not too great to be forgiven, but not mine, end quote, is a form of spiritual masochism rooted in pride. He persists in believing he's not forgivable because he worries whether he has the freedom to be forgiven. He thus rationalizes the continuation of his own sins, in part because he believes he's not capable of repenting. On a theological view, however, that does not deny that grace is genuinely available to all men everywhere, Jack could be seen to be laboring under a theological delusion that stifles his own moral progress and leads him unnecessarily to reject the grace available to him. In short, Robinson's Calvinism undermines what is best about her phenomenological vision. At the same time, I want to suggest that adopting universalism is not the right way to secure what is best about Robinson's life-affirming vision of faith. It's worth noting that both Ames and Boughton ascribe to the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. Indeed, Ames often speaks admiringly of Calvin, and Robinson herself is known to be someone who thinks highly of Calvin's theology. For Robinson, then, quote, the problem of Jack is of central theological importance. In a world in which some people are ostensibly predestined to perdition, God's justice or goodness might be called into question. This is why, for example, Ames himself admits that the topic of predestination is his least favorite one in the whole world. The question of predestination is what haunts Jack deeply, and it's why he puts the question of whether those who are damned can know so to Ames and Boughton towards the end of Gilead. As Kemp and Rogers observe, Ames's handling of the conversation leaves much to be desired. Robinson clearly intends for us to feel that Ames has bungled the encounter. Lila herself later gently rebukes Ames by telling Ames that Jack was being sincere and didn't mean to perturb him. Jack, as Lila sees, is someone who sincerely is anguished by what he takes to be the real possibility that he's forsaken by God, destined for damnation. I should like to register 3 points in response to the theological framing of Robinson's treatment of Jack. First, the easiest way to resolve Jack's existential predicament would be simply to abandon Ames's own Calvinism. For what it's worth, I happen to think that the Calvinistic conception of predestination is untrue. We might therefore conclude that the true tragedy of Jack is that he's unnecessarily laboring under the fear of a false theological doctrine. This leads to the second point. Rogers and Kemp, for their part, attempt to resolve the problem posed by predestination to God's justice by opting for universalism. Here I should note that I don't believe the doctrine of hell calls into question God's justice or goodness in the way Rogers and Kemp seem to believe that it does. The doctrine of hell needn't lead those who hold it to be callous to unbelievers, as if they were merely predestined to damnation. Only a Calvinist must think this. Nor must it lead to despair. On the contrary, it should be cause for sober self-reflection and self-examination. Rather than pointing the finger at others whom we believe are lost, we should examine ourselves with fear and trembling to make sure that we ourselves are living a life of faithfulness that God will find pleasing. This, in turn, leads to sympathy and concern for our neighbor, not hypocritical judgment of him. The thought that some of those we love may die lost is a truly terrible one. Rather, however, than denying this truth for that reason, the acknowledgement of the seriousness of sin and the need for salvation in Christ should lead us to do all we can in this life to leave a testimony that might inspire others to convert also. Think of Monica's years of prayer for her son Augustine's repentance. It makes our time all the more precious and serious. This leads to the third and final remark concerning Jack. If we reject both Calvinism and universalism, it's possible to see Jack as his own worst enemy. Not in the sense that he's irrevocably lost and so beyond hope, but that he's pitiable precisely because he's genuinely free to receive God's grace if only he should finally prove willing to do so. Rather than reconciling ourselves to the hard truth that Jack may well be destined for perdition, or coddling him as if he merely is the victim of circumstances, we can view him as a complicated moral agent who, despite his life's trials and tribulations, remains capable of finding reconciliation with God and the peace that he believes might necessarily elude him. What makes Jack a tragic figure, in my view, is not that he's predestined to perdition, nor that he suffers under the false illusion that he won't be saved in his current condition, but that he has the power to change that condition through a repentance that would transform his life and redeem him, but he hasn't yet, and may never will. In the end, Jack is responsible for much of his suffering because of his own sins. This doesn't mean that he deserves to be ostracized or shamed or written off as a lost cause, but we do a prodigal son no favors by pretending that he needn't come to his senses and get out of the pig pen. Although this isn't the place to examine fully the various competing theological doctrines of predestination, grace, and human freedom, it's worth noting that Robinson's phenomenological fiction naturally lends itself to these theological reflections, not because it's imposed such ideas onto its stories artificially, but rather because the depiction of her characters reveal the exigency of such questions insofar as their own lives are rendered faithfully amid the world as they experience it. Here again, then, phenomenological description of being in the world leads naturally to theological reflection on being before God. And although this is not the place either to press an argument against universalism, I should like simply to note that there is a third theological position available, neither Calvinism nor universalism, that can accommodate and encourage what's best about the universalist urge, namely that God's love is such that he desires all men to be saved, without denying life's greatest exigency. We will all, in the end, be answerable to God on the day of judgment. We now can see how Ames's response to Jack, culminating in his blessing Jack before Jack leaves town, has answered Feuerbach and Nietzsche's objection that Christianity is an aesthetic form of life denial. To begin with, Robinson does not contradict Ames's originally stated advice that one never discuss God from a posture of defense. Nor does she contradict his advice that one accordingly never offer attempted rational proofs for God's existence. That would be, as Ames had said earlier, to engage in irrelevancies. Avoiding what would otherwise have been a glaring self-refutation, Robinson answers the atheist not with traditional philosophical or theological proofs, but by offering a literary vision that affirms the Christian vision of creation, with particular focus on the world's beauty and the ethical imperative to demonstrate the love of neighbor. This is why we might speak of Robinson's phenomenology. She's not provided an argument for Christianity, but rather unveiled the world through a description that shows the goodness and beauty of God's creation. When reading Robinson, although we may notice traces of Marion's saturated phenomenon or Levinas's face, her fiction is not a commentary on such philosophical concepts. It is itself a phenomenological explication of them. This is why Ames is drawn to write, and yet invariably, in the course of doing so, is led to confront the inadequacy of his response to what is called forth those words. Quote, "If only I had the words to tell you," end quote. He writes of an experience too beautiful and meaningful to do justice. This ineffability, this excess, this surplus of beauty is an issue to which he turns again later. Quote, "That biscuit ashy from my father's charred hand, it all means more than I can tell you. So you must not judge what I know, but by what I find words for," end quote. Contrary, then, to Wittgenstein's famous claim that the limits of our language are the limits of our world, for Robinson, we experience the limits of our language precisely in light of the world's disclosed beauty that outstrips it. Nearing the end of his letters, Ames thus writes, quote, "There are two occasions when the sacred beauty of creation becomes dazzlingly apparent, and they occur together. One is when we feel our mortal insufficiency to the world, and the other is when we feel the world's mortal insufficiency to us, end quote. He does not mention that these lines are direct allusions to Olderlin's Hyperion. Whether the literary allusion to Olderlin is deliberate or not by Ames, it certainly must be by Robinson herself. Yet be that as it may, what matters is what the words express, namely, that life is short. No matter then the nature of our past or our relation to it, the generations pass. Ames, his father, and his grandfather all have come and gone. Even Ames's beloved Lila and Robbie will too. Even if Ames had had the family he wanted sooner, it would not last forever. Nothing in this life does. For all Ames's exultation over this present world's beauty, the fact remains then that a pall of death would hang over everything were there only this world. That would be enough to be cause for despair, as it is for Faulkner, whose literary vision knows no God. This despair that life's impermanence would occasion is captured most beautifully by a passage from Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. Ames never explicitly mentions Kierkegaard, but it would be surprising if he had never read him, especially in light of how his reflections on the passage of time, especially those made in light of his family's passing generations, lead inexorably to thoughts of eternity. Kierkegaard says, quote, if there were no sacred bond that knit humankind together, if one generation emerged after another like forest foliage, if one generation succeeded another like the singing of birds in the forest, if a generation passed through the world as a ship through the sea, as wind through the desert, an unthinking and unproductive performance, if an eternal oblivion, perpetually hungry, lurked for its prey, and there were no powers strong enough to wrench that away from it, how empty and devoid of consolation life would be, end quote. As Robinson's phenomenology shows, this present world is affirmable, not merely for the sake of its beauty unveiled here and now, but for its prefiguration, revealed to those with eyes to see, of an even still more beautiful one to come, a Christian vision of creation that such fiction aims to reveal. It's to Kemp and Rogers' great credit to have shown why that aesthetic religious vision is not at all life-denying, but on the contrary, life-affirming. The generations come and go, but God abides. And for that reason, life affirmation means living in light of beauty's full promise.